there's this massive sort of bias toward, if something doesn't have mass appeal, then as an industry, we're just not interested in putting it in print at all. Now, the problem is that skill set around building online distribution is not the same skill set as writing a really, 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 really awesome book.
We're going to see a Cambrian-like explosion of new books that under the old system would never have seen print.
I think the author has a compass, and the compass is pointing them toward a book. My job as the publisher is to remind them that they have that compass and remind them to look at it and not get distracted by other shiny things other than that compass. Make art, not noise. Life is too short for disposable content.
Well, hello, everybody. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with yet another Infinite Loops. Today, I am super excited to have on a fellow publisher who has a very, very unique way of looking at the publishing industry. Her name is Ellen Fishbein. She's the founder of Altamira Studios. You started as a writing coach. By the way, I had no idea how famous you were. Here are the people you worked with as a writing coach: David Perell, Shane Parrish, Derek Sivers, Coleman Hughes. Oh my God. You even had David Perell say Ellen is like Rick Rubin for writing. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here and super excited.
It's really great to have you on. Did you take the name of your studio from that prehistoric cave where all the beautiful paintings are, or no?
Yes, I sure did. Do you know the Steely Dan song, Caves of Altamira?
I do, yes.
I am a lifelong Steely Dan fan. I've seen them live a bunch of times, and I loved that song for many, many years. And eventually I looked up, what is this song about? The Caves of Altamira. What are they singing about? Because it's an incredible song. And yeah, it's this 30,000-year-old cave that has these incredible paintings in it from, 25,000 years before the invention of writing. But it's just this lasting testament to human creativity. And I thought that was so beautiful. And especially in our day and age where we have so much ephemeral, disposable stuff that we're doing, this idea of, we're all about a lasting creative pursuit and expression just felt like the right thing to do.
Yeah, I love all of those caves. There's a bunch of good documentaries on several of them. I don't know whether you've seen them. Werner Herzog did a really interesting one. I can't recall the title of it right now, but I watched it a couple of times. And that voice of his is you just want to listen.
Yeah, I can't get enough of that guy.
So I'm fascinated by what you call the new book deal. You are an incredibly innovative publisher, backed by your ability to also serve as a great writing coach. So tell me a little bit about the new book deal that you are offering to both the public, well, it's actually the writers, but the public benefits.
Yeah, so the big picture of the really, really big idea behind what I noticed from being embedded in the publishing industry and the way that I have been is that there are these blockages to getting things to a small but passionate kind of niche audience. There's this massive sort of bias toward, if something doesn't have mass appeal or the potential for just reaching, millions and millions and millions of people, then we're just not, as an industry, we're just not interested in putting it in print at all. But the print format is actually really valuable for content, even if it's sometimes, especially if it is directed towards sort of a niche group. So we have this thing called the new book deal, which is intended to help people harness kind of their first, earliest true believers. And the way it works is you pitch me your idea, let me know what you want to write about. And if my team and I think that it's a great idea, then we'll say, okay, cool. You get a pre-order page on our website, And as soon as you hit 600 pre-orders, we can print your book. It's basically that simple. And it's inspired by the fact that what I've found with, my initial project, the very, very first thing that we started printing, which was almost like a guinea pig, like an experiment, was this book, Spacefaring, which I wrote.
Look at what I have right in front of me. Yeah. For those who are just listening to us, I'm holding up the same book as Ella. It's great, by the way.
So it's a really interesting thing. So I'm a poet at heart. Like, that's the earliest thing that I ever was. When I was like even a little kid, people would be like, oh, wow, she's like reading Shakespeare and she's like 10 years old. And I was really moved by the poetry of Shakespeare. I was moved by the poetry of William Butler Yeats and all these people growing up. And I started writing it for decades. I've written like thousands of poems and all this kind of stuff. And that's where a lot of that writing coaching and editorial ability comes from. People sort of a lot of times think like, oh, yeah, you're known for kind of being this business writing coach who's helped all these people with their business writing projects. But poetry was really the whetstone for all of that stuff, like having to develop the discipline of being able to say something meaningful in just a few words and putting in the reps of doing that over decades is how I got to the point of being able to do a lot of the stuff that I've been able to do with people, with helping people write memos that have raised like millions and millions of dollars and all this kind of stuff. And so I wanted to give people like a point of reference. Hey, this was the stuff that actually got me here. And also show people that it's a process of getting better at writing. Like, hey, I wasn't as good in 2016 as 2017, 2018, 2019. It takes time. And I wanted to send people my poetry. I just wanted to do that. And so I looked into like self-publishing on Amazon, and I found that the print quality with the self-publishing process on Amazon was just like utter garbage. Like all of the print-on-demand books, the way that there were all these imperfections in the quality to begin with. And also, as a poet, I see there's a misconception with poets and poetry. Like, it's sort of seen as this kind of dusty, like old school thing. But in fact, like the core responsibility of a poet is to be on the frontier of language and on the frontier of writing. And part of that is doing things like using emojis in your poetry, which is something that I do in Spacefaring. But Amazon's system didn't actually allow you to properly display emojis and all this kind of stuff. So I was like, okay, well, if I want this thing to be done right, and if I want it to be distributed in something that's high quality that people will pay any attention to at all, because most people will actually pay money to avoid having to read something that you send them if it's like a poetry collection, then I've got to figure out how to do it myself. So I found this local printer in Texas, and my team and I learned everything about book design, the covers, the interiors, the materials that go into it, the lead times, what kinds of, different factors go into being able to produce a book. And we figured out how to produce this. We went from not having ever produced a book to kind of doing it from scratch. And when I started sending out this book, even to just a few hundred people who were just kind of in my network, whose email addresses I had just been collecting, I started sending out this book. I started just giving it to people, sending it to people, saying, hey, do you want this book? It was a force multiplier for my business, even though it wasn't like a book about writing coaching or anything like that. It was nothing of that sort, but it was something that was physically present in people's space. And it was something that reminded them of who I was. And it was something that felt like a gift to them. And so just having that small group of people have a copy of my book, it made them sort of never forget about how they met me or when they met me or any of that kind of stuff. So I would have people calling me 9 months later being like, hey, yeah, your book is like still on my desk. I remember we had this conversation about like collaborating on a writing project. So can we do that now? And people would just come back. They would actually remember me. A year later, I would like see them at something and they would be like, oh yeah, like I actually read that thing. You had this poem about wisdom. And I was like really moved by that. And thank you so much for sharing that with me and all this stuff. So I saw that like the power of having the print format available to you and having a high quality print, having that book available to you, even for a very small like niche group, was actually like something that I didn't want to give up. Now that I had seen it, I was like, I can never go back. So the idea behind the new book deal, the idea behind everything we're doing at Altamira is to make high quality printing, to make that print format, high quality, beautiful design, exactly what the person wants for their book available to them, even if it's kind of like a niche group. And the new book deal makes it possible without even having to pay money up front, because there's a lot of like self-publishing operations out there where you'll pay them like $50,000 up front and they'll, do whatever you want for your book. But the new book deal is kind of like a crowdfunding approach that allows people to get that, even if they don't have the upfront cash, which I think is important because a lot of really, really, really talented people don't have tens of thousands of dollars in upfront cash. So I hope that wasn't too long-winded.
No, that wasn't too long-winded at all. You also note you have 4 Bibles, and one of them are Shakespeare's sonnets. And that's something we share. When I was a teenager, I loved poetry. I still do. But I memorized 100 poems, and many of them were Shakespeare's sonnets. Like, shall I compare thee? Yeah. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. What winds do shake the darling buds of May and summer's late, that all too short a date. The reason I did it was a couple, kind of threefold. First off, I wanted to impress the ladies. Let's just be really honest. Yeah. And in 1978, there were not many 18-year-olds who could, do the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock and then follow it up with Andrew Marvell's To His Coy Mistress. So that was kind of my, to be honest, the real motivation. But I also had been thinking a lot about memorization and how memorization of anything, not just poems because I loved them, right? But of many things really helped you make connections that you couldn't make otherwise, right? So in conversation, coming across a passage when you're reading, etc., you're like, oh my God, that's just like Eliot, where he says, I have come to tell you all, I shall tell you all. And she says, that isn't what I meant at all. And then you just start making all these really cool connections. And then the third thing was basically, I just felt that I should be able to just like quote something in its full length, because that seemed very, very important to me. But I was really interested to see you listing the sonnets as one of your 4 Bibles. Talk a little bit about why that is, because the other ones are a little more obvious to me. But tell me why the sonnets actually are one of your writing Bibles.
Yeah, so it goes back to this kind of poets being responsible for the frontier of language and the frontier of bringing language forward. And Shakespeare was one of those poets. So a lot of people don't know. I don't know. You may know this. Maybe you know this. A lot of people don't know that Shakespeare was actually the co-founder of the Globe Theater, which is that like big famous theater. You know that.
Yep.
Most people don't know that. So that famous theater in London where all of Shakespeare's plays were performed and all that kind of stuff, and which is actually still operational in the sort of like revised format today, was co-founded by Shakespeare, and his stake in the Globe Theater allowed him to retire like a pretty well-to-do guy to like the British countryside and everything. And that came from, originally he had this group of actors called the Lord Chamberlain's Men, who he was kind of traveling with, and times were tough. There was the Black Plague. There was all this stuff going on. And a lot of theatrical performances got shut down. And it was just a really tough time for actors and writers and all this stuff. But Shakespeare was like, hey, you know what? I can write these plays And I can make sure that my theater company is the only company that technically, like legally, has the right to perform any of my plays. And if I get together with like 5 of my best friends and we start this theater company together, then it's going to be hard for other people to shut us down or kick us out or give us the boot or tell us to go away or anything like that. And so that's exactly what they did. And they had the Globe Theater and they were like, yeah, we put on Shakespeare's plays. We're really amazing. Shakespeare wrote like all these plays for the Globe Theater. They put it on, they brought in crowds. And the thing about it was that writing was the core. So the majority of the population of England, the majority of these audiences that were coming into the Globe Theater were like totally illiterate. They couldn't read any words at all. But Shakespeare was like, I'm not going to dumb myself down for these people. Instead, what I'm going to do, and with the sonnets were actually the primordial soup, you could say, of a lot of his later stuff. A lot of the sonnets were written relatively early. He wrote a lot of them before he wrote a lot of his very, very great, most famous plays. And if you're someone like me and you're like a big nerd, you'll go and find cross-references where like a decade later, he'll sort of quote himself in a play, something that he wrote in the sonnets 10 years earlier. The sonnets, just like what I was kind of describing earlier, the sonnets were the whetstone. They were the training ground. They were the place where Shakespeare learned how to write to be able to create these plays that then drew these crowds. And so originally he was writing for just this small group of people, like the 10% of people who could actually read. That was like the audience for the sonnets. And then later on, he would write for larger groups of people, but he never lost that dedication to quality and that commitment to beauty and to truth that he developed in the sonnets. And so that's why whenever I'm lost, and kudos to you for digging up that article about the Bibles. I think I wrote that in like 2018 or something. So I'm impressed. But it's still, yeah, to this day, like whenever I'm lost, whenever I'm like confused or anything like that, I can always find guidance there because Shakespeare says all this stuff about how to write. And for example, like he talks about how a really great use case for writing is creating like an imprint or an impression of your mind so that you can become reacquainted with your mind later. So you know this because I know you, Jim, like you've gone into like some of your old diaries from like way back. And I have the same thing. And in fact, I've like asked my parents to like burn some of them. Because I'm like, oh God, But like you go and you become reacquainted. You made back then with that writing, you create, it was like a handprint that you left on the page, but it was like of your mind, and you go back and you're like, wow, I can become reacquainted with this person who was writing this stuff 10, 20, 30, however many years ago. And it's like I'm making a new friend all over again. And it's like I can bring that back to life. And Shakespeare had all these incredible insights about writing along those lines that are just both inspirational and sort of educational, that are all just in the sonnets. That's just kind of where he documented all that stuff. So the sonnets have been very, very important to me. And it also just goes to show, I mean, there's 154 sonnets. You've memorized a bunch of them. That's awesome. I love that. And they all have the same format. It's like 14 lines. They've got, 4 that have a rhyme scheme, 4, 2 that rhyme with each other. They've all got the same format. They've all got, 10 syllables per line and the whole thing. And I've often compared it to tweeting. Like a lot of writers these days get started with writing by tweeting. And when the tweet constraint was really, really rigid, like when you could never extend a tweet, that was like really good. The either the 280 or 140 characters, that constraint creates an exercise that forces you to get better at saying stuff within that constraint. And that was what the sonnet was for Shakespeare as well. So you can see him like going through the reps of learning how to handle this constraint and getting better and better at saying something worth saying within this quite challenging constraint of the sonnet form, like kind of similar to a tweet. So yeah, it was the proving ground. It was the training ground. It was the dojo. And so whenever I'm confused, that's where I go.
I love it. I love the fact that Shakespeare. I've been down many Shakespeare rabbit holes because he's one of my favorite authors of all time. And like, if you just go down the list, use of new words, use of new phrases, invention of words, etc., and you look it up, well, there is good old Billy at the top of the list. So kind of not just a great writer, poet, but also an amazing thinker with a incredible understanding of the human condition. And those tend to be my favorite poets. I often sometimes some people think I'm joking, but I'm really not joking. Where I say that the poets and philosophers of yesteryear are basically the rappers and rock musicians of today. I don't know if you read the lyrics of, say, Pink Floyd, like the lyrics read like T.S. Eliot. Lips that would kiss form prayers to broken stone is an Eliot line. And yet when you go through the Pink Floyd lyrics, it's not the same line, but it's really, really similar. So I definitely think, people who lament, there isn't this kind of form available today or that type of writer, not necessarily. You might just have to look elsewhere. I want to jump back, though, to the new book deal, because presumably when you decide on a project, right, and they give you the outline, you got to write the book, right? So do you help them with the writing of the book, or once the outline is approved, do you say, okay, we need a manuscript before you get to the number of people on the campaign, or how does that work?
Yeah, so my sense, the new book deal is still like very experimental. I'll be totally honest. And it's one of a few experiments that we have going on at Altamira because like I sort of say a lot, we're trying to be at the frontier. We kind of are at the frontier. We can't help ourselves. It's very experimental. So my sense is that the people who are a good fit for the new book deal are actually going to struggle more with getting the pre-orders than with writing the book. We do help them. We do definitely help them write the book. And in the past, and we still have our writing coaching service, and we help people write books all the time. We've helped people write extremely successful books and, traditional books that kind of fit the cookie cutter thing that kind of the legacy publishing industry likes and all that kind of stuff. And we're very familiar with that stuff. The people who are a fit for the new book deal, they have a vision for the book, and they have the ability to write, and they have some chops. They need some editorial guidance. They need a publisher. I'm still kind of, in a way, I'm learning in what way an author really needs to be served by a publisher. It's something about the way I see it is the author has a compass. A lot of people say like the author kind of has a book, you have a book in you. And I kind of can't stand that language. I think that's sort of like very bad. I just doesn't resonate with me at all. I think the author has a compass, and the compass is pointing them toward a book. And it's pointing them towards something that they want to see materialize in the world. And I think that my job as the publisher is to remind them that they have that compass and remind them to look at it and not get distracted by other shiny things other than that compass. So we're providing a lot of editorial support, but the authors, like for example, Jason Levin, who did the new book deal and created this book, Memes Make Millions, which is really fun. He knew, like, he had a very strong vision for what he wanted. And it had a lot to do with like interviewing these people who have made a lot of waves on social media by being funny. And he had a really, really strong vision. And what he really needed was like someone to say, yep, we're going to execute on this vision together. We're going to follow through on this. We're actually going to go ahead. We're going to put up a pre-order page. There's going to be a mock-up cover design on the pre-order page. We're going to collect pre-orders for it together. We're going to promise people that the book's going to come out at such and such a time. And we're actually going to follow through on that idea because the vision was there. The idea was there. But just like doing it all by himself on Gumroad or something like that, he may very well have followed through with it, but the execution wouldn't have been as good, and the timing might not have been as good. And also, it's very easy for people like Jason. I think, he's great. He had a lot of conviction in his idea, but I think for a lot of people, it's really easy to sort of like lose their conviction in their vision. And I think I have a good ear for like, yeah, you know what? You're onto something with that. Like, stick with that, follow that, trust that. Does that make sense?
Totally. So it's a bit like you're very helpful in being able to see, oh, that should be a book. Like when you're getting all these submissions, Memes Make Millions is a good example. But you're also really good at serving as a partner. A lot of people, I think, lose the conviction because they really don't have anyone that's spurring them on, that's saying, no, this really is a good idea. You really should continue to do that. And also your idea of focusing on, say, short form books and niches where traditional publishing just appears to tread because they're so risk avoidant. It makes total sense. I want to go back briefly to your Bibles, and I have a couple of questions. The first is, have you found any additional Bibles since the 4 that you listed that we found? But I also want to ask you about one that really fascinated me when I saw it, because it's one of my favorite books, and that is Hesse's Glass Bead Game.
Yeah.
Why is that one of your Bibles for writing? I think I know why, but I'd like to hear it from you.
Well, it's biblical. It's funny. I don't know if that article is called Bibles for Writing or just Bibles. Like the principle there is like when you're lost, you come back to this. I mean, I didn't read it in the original German. I like wish I could.
Nor did I. Yeah.
So whether it's my Bible for writing in that case is a little bit like, maybe, I don't know. It's a little hard to say, but I should probably talk to my dad who can read German. But the thing about Herman Hesse, okay, so I really like Herman Hesse because he was, in a way, with like a lot of his earlier stuff, Glass Bead Game is kind of like his like magnum opus. He won the Nobel for that, as you know. When did you read it, by the way? Did you read it
I read it when I was in my early 20s, and I had read Siddhartha when I was a teenager, and I'd gotten obsessed with Taoism. And so my dad, his first job actually was as a literature professor at a local college. And so he saw me reading the Tao Te Ching, and he's like, oh, you should read. And then he literally handed me the book, Siddhartha by Hesse, and I loved it. And so I tend to be a little obsessive. And when I love an author, I try at least to read everything they've ever written. And so, yeah, I was in my young 20s.
Okay, I love that. And it speaks to exactly the point with Hesse, because the way, when people have never heard of Herman Hesse, what I say to people is he was like one of the very first young adult authors, except his audience was young adults who had fought in World War I. So it's a little different than your today's 15-year-old who, probably hasn't been in a war yet and hopefully never will, right? But like at that time, a lot of his earliest stuff, like the book Damien, which I love, that stuff was all directed toward people young men who were kind of just getting out of World War I and just finding their footing, like if they were fortunate, finding their footing, having been veterans of this war. And so it's storytelling, on this really profound, like deep soul searching level that helps you figure out like, who are you and what is your purpose in the world? And like, what are you put on this earth to do? And Glass Bead Game, I love because it's, in certain ways, it's the culmination of a lot of Herman Hesse's work. It's in certain ways, it's the least legible and definitely like one of his longest things that he ever wrote. But I think that the premise is you have this utopian world where like academia actually works.
Yeah. We might put that into the category of fantasy, right?
Yeah, I mean, like really, it's like up there with ogres and goblins and elves, right? Like academia actually working. So you have this like magical kind of utopian world where academia like actually works, and it kind of takes the form of this sort of like monastic society of people who sort of like hold the intellect to be sacred in this way. And they have this metaphorical, and the whole Glass Bead Game is never really described concretely. It's just a metaphor for like drawing analogies between different fields. And it's like, there's so much about that I love. I want to know what you love about it. But one of the things I love about it is that Herman Hesse was just like, I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to give, it's like everybody who kind of wish it, like everybody, when you're a little kid, and when I was a kid, I realized I wasn't going to major in English or creative writing at some point. That's what everyone thought I was going to do. I ended up studying economics and math because I realized I could like teach all the English classes. And so I'm like, you realize like, oh, this system, this kind of education system, even if you're a very schoolish kind of bookish kid, eventually you realize it's that ivory tower is not as beautiful as you sort of hoped it would be. But Herman Hesse is like, what if it were? Like, what if we actually had this like society of people who really, and I just love that he committed to that and he made that vision real and he created this very, very sophisticated and kind of like glittering magical metaphor for just combining of minds. I just love that. I mean, you have so little storytelling that is so elevated now. It's very rare. And he has these great piercing insights about how pseudo-intellectualism is like all about gravitating toward keywords and like individual little sound bites. And this is like in the 50s, He's like, yeah, so pseudo-intellectualism, he's got these insights about how people gravitate toward just keywords and sound bites rather than being awestruck by the magnificence of like the whole idea. And like, I love that. I just love his kind of vision of the world and how he continues to be able to, that book can do, I think, for a less young adult, what some of his earlier kind of more lightweight books can do for younger adults, which is like help you dive back into like, who am I? What was I put on this earth for? But what about you? Like, how are you affected by it?
I pulled it out to reread after finding it as one of your Bibles. And so I will be in the, unfortunately, it is, I think, number 3 in the stack. So I actually checked my notes from that period, and I loved, because you got to remember, I just finished Siddhartha, and then I read that one, and I just thought that one of my notes was, God, and this would be in the early 1980s. So a lot of people think a lot of the degradation in writing and everything was something, that happened recently. Well, it's like the old joke. I'm sure it's apocryphal, but, the first piece of Sumerian that they were able to translate was a young poet's lament saying that all the good poems have already been written. So but in my notes, it was like, I think my exact line was, God, I wish people could still write like this today. And so what struck me the most about it, not only the way he put the ideas together and everything else, but just how gorgeously it was written. They're just like amazing from my point of view, which leads me, and I don't want to spend all our time on your Bibles, but this one also intrigued me. So we go from that to From Zero to One by Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
So I when I looked at that, I'm like, okay, I almost made it my first question, but I decided against that. It shows your range to me, at least. But explain a little bit. Are we going from the sublime to the practical? What's going on with?
Well, I'm grateful for that. You know, it's funny. A lot of people like Matt. One of my friends and advisors, Matt Lerner. He one time like expressed this like sort of feeling of surprise, kind of like what you're expressing now. He's like, yeah, it's really interesting that you're like all about this business writing stuff, but you're like also a poet and you're really into this poetry and literature stuff. And that like throws people for a loop all the time. But I think Peter, so first of all, my co-founder at Altamira is a former Palantir guy. So I have some familiarity with sort of the effects. I've some relatively personal insight on sort of the effects of some of Peter Thiel's work. And so, you know, witnessing the culture at Palantir, just kind of like understanding some of the things about Palantir and seeing that really was and was when I kind of met a bunch of people there some years ago, a really extraordinary company. I was like, I better read this book because I didn't get to work there. I actually interviewed there and I tried to drop out of college to join, which is kind of a funny story.
Well, that would have impressed Peter for sure.
They basically said, they actually gave me an on-site interview, but they were like, maybe you should like finish college and come back when you're like of age to drink. But anyway, that was basically, but it was a good experience actually. And so witnessing that and seeing that, I was like, oh, I better like learn a little more about kind of other stuff related to this. And so I read 0 to 1. I watched some of Peter Thiel's lectures and all that kind of stuff. And I think 0 to 1 is one of the very, very best business books that has been written. So when people ask me about business writing and like business nonfiction, I point them toward that. And I think one of the reasons for that was actually the process by which it was created. So like Peter Thiel and Blake Masters, you know, they had this like student teacher type of thing where Blake Masters was taking all these notes and all this kind of stuff. And there's a sense in which it was the output of, it was not written. A lot of people have so many misconceptions about writing and like writing a book, and they think about writing a book and they're like, while they're writing the book, they're like thinking about Oprah and like the millions of people who are going to be reading the book and all this stuff. But that book was the outcome of a process where there were like a bunch of students in a room, and one of them was taking like really, really, really good notes. That was Blake Masters. And there was this very personal delivery of information to like people who could be seen and touched in that same space. And it was this act of communication that was happening within a group of actual people. And I think that there are probably a lot of people who have a lot of great insights who could kind of put those insights into a book potentially, but they don't have the opportunity, or the stars don't line up for them to be able to have a process that really takes them back to having to communicate to actual people. And I think the result was very much related to that. And a lot of what we've done in writing coaching with my team kind of rhymes with that in many ways. It's like, you're going to do your best writing when you are trying to communicate to someone who you can name and someone whose face you can see or at least call to mind. And so that's one of the things. And also just in general, the overall philosophy of like competition is for losers. Like you have a publishing company. My friend Eric Jorgensen, also your friend, he's got a publishing company. There's a bunch of people, Ben Paton, there's a bunch of people who have publishing companies out there. Penguin is a publishing company, Simon & Schuster, all these things. I do not see you or any of those people as competitors at all. I just don't, because I have the mindset of at Altamira, we are trying to do something quite distinctive. We're at the frontier. We're trying to do something that just isn't the same thing as what any of the other publishers are doing. And that book was very influential in kind of helping me realize, like, yeah, there is, I really do believe that my team and I have kind of like a distinct gift to give to the media world. And it's not about fighting over kind of the same outcomes. It's about thinking differently.
I love that. And for what it's worth, we have kind of the same attitude at Infinite Books. We don't view you as a competitor. We don't view Eric as a competitor. We love the fact that there are all of these new companies trying to reinvent, reimagine publishing, because I've written 4 books, all nonfiction, and all specifically, for the most part, about the stock market. And having experienced the traditional route and being quite dismayed by it, to be quite frank, I've always sort of had in the back of my mind, gosh, it would be fun to start a publishing company and like kind of do the things that I think would work much better. Which also kind of leads me to your 10 high convictions. The first of which, if I recall correctly, was traditional publishers, and we should get our nomenclature right here. Traditional publishers, for our listeners and viewers, those are the names right? Simon & Schuster, Penguin Books, et cetera, et cetera. And I have a particular point of view about many of them, and I think you share it with me, Ellen. But one of the things that you said that really struck me, and I really thought about it for a while, and that was they don't really have respect for their smart readers. Expand on that idea and where that leads to.
I think the clearest way to understand that, the simplest way to understand that, is just in terms of how much fluff is in books. So there's a lot of things under the surface that, and I appreciate you reading that tweet thread. It's funny. It's like, it's always the tip of the iceberg of so many things. So here's a great story about my friend Ilya. He's a gifted software engineer, and he published a book with like one of these legacy publishers, right? And he co-wrote it. And so he and his co-author, and it was like an engineer, like a technical engineering book. So he and his co-author wrote like a 150-page book or something. And they were like, here you go. This is what we have to say about this very technical topic for other very technical people. And the publisher, this was not long ago. This was maybe 10 years ago. Okay. The publisher comes back and goes, we can't publish a 150-page book. You've got to figure out how to make it 300 pages. And so what they did, because they're engineers and they're like good engineers, so they're lazy. What they did is they had this whole like repository of like code snippets and like things like that was just linked, that was going to be kind of a digital resource that was going to be linked in the book. Hey, if you need to copy and paste some code, you can do that by going to this webpage. So they literally just put it in the manuscript, and it was like 150 pages of code snippets that they just printed in the book, in the manuscript, to make the book meet the page limit. I wish I were making this up.
It's just so funny.
I wish I were, right? So they put that in the book, and the publisher said, "Okay, great." And so it's like, wow, it's like just the complete and total. It's like, forget about, I mean, wasting paper is neither here nor there. Like, yeah, it's a waste of paper, but also, what? It's like absurd, right? And so what I learned, so that was like one anecdote. There's all kinds of stuff. Typically in a contract with an author, the publisher will mandate like a minimum word count, but that is quite high. And it's usually like 65,000 words at the very lowest. And the trouble is that, and that's exactly why we have all of these books that people who are smart people who, read a lot and who love reading, will pick up a nonfiction book that's published like nowadays, and they'll start reading it. And like 35 pages in, they'll realize that they've gotten past all the substance that's in the book. And that has a lot to do with just a bunch of rules that these publishers have about how much they're allowed to charge for a book of a certain length, and like how they require these minimum word counts and all this kind of stuff. And to me, like, a smart person is a person who places a high value on his or her time, like, for starters, right? And so if that smart group of readers, when I say they're underserved by the publishing industry, that is one very, very clear example. Like, why would the real price I'm paying for this book is not $20. It's 8 hours of my time or 3 hours of my time or whatever time I'm going to put in to reading that book. And so that's why at Altamira, typically, rather than having a minimum word count in our contracts, we actually literally have a maximum word count in our contracts. And I worked with these guys who wrote this book called Ask Aristotle, which is a lot of fun. And it's 87 pages long. And it's an introduction to Aristotle that is accessible. And by the way, like, it's not written in complex academic language at all. Like, if you paste it into the Hemingway app, which I love, it will tell you that this is written at a 6th grade reading level. That's not to say it's dumbed down, not in the slightest. Like, you have this, it's not dumbed down. It's not dumbed down at all. What it is respectful of the reader's time. And there's going to be an audiobook, and the audiobook's going to be like 3 hours. And those 3 hours are going to be awesome. And it doesn't need any more than that. And because we're not like a legacy instrument, we can actually do that. So that's just one example. I can kind of go on and on about that. Another thing is it kind of rhymes with like what Hollywood is doing by and large. But I'll just say one more thing about that kind of underserved kind of like smartest group of readers. They value their time, but that fact is being ignored. And another thing is that what the publishers, they kind of used to be sort of talent scouts. They used to like go looking for kind of undiscovered talent and try to find that and bring it to market. But now what they're doing is they're scouting out people who have already brought themselves to market by building like a large social media following. And they're going, oh, okay, they're just doing a numbers kind of math game, right? They're like, if you have 200,000 newsletter subscribers, then you can probably sell at least 20,000 books. So just as a math, thing. And so we're happy. Now, the problem is that skill set around building online distribution is not the same skill set as writing a really, 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 really awesome book. Sometimes people who can do both of those things overlap, but most of the time they don't. And also, there's a lot of really, really smart readers who don't use social media. They don't use Twitter. They don't use these platforms. They don't sign up for newsletters because, again, they value their time. They don't want emails all the time. And so those people aren't being taken into consideration with these decisions.
I completely agree. And one of the things that we believe at Infinite Books is that having good taste, being incredibly and insatiably curious, and finding those folks wherever they happen to be, and then getting in touch with them and saying, wow, we think you have a great book. Are you interested? You're doing the same thing. I kind of think of the traditional publishers having the mindset of a kind of a medieval guild system. And one of your high conviction things, which I totally agree with, is the idea that there are or have become, I think it'd be a better way of looking at it, because publishers used to do exactly what you said. They used to take big risks on people that they thought were enormously talented. And they don't seem to do that much anymore. And it's a bit like, it's a bit like they're clipping coupons almost. In other words, they have this huge back catalog, which, that's where they're making like the majority of their money is on the books that they've already published. Yes, they do the splashy $1 million advances to Prince Harry or whomever, but that I think is just to get attention. Like I got one big advance for one of my books, but that was only because my previous book, What Works on Wall Street, had inexplicably, I must say, become a bestseller. And I say inexplicably because it was like charts and graphs, basically, to be honest. Like your friends who put all the code in the book. This was, of course, intentionally done because I wanted it to be kind of like a textbook, like a Baedeker. Okay, so everyone says buying stocks with low PEs is a good way to invest. I want to say, well, where's the evidence? And that was the seed of the idea for What Works on Wall Street. But they have become, to my eye, just not only risk averse in seeking out new and bright talent, but also in the clinging to ways of doing things, a playbook that is no longer relevant, that doesn't really work anymore. And you get these really weird things like, I still remember it. I just got one from my agent, right? And it was a royalty statement. And literally, you know what they look like. Like they're a single line. We sold, pick a number, which I think is often imaginary. We sold 5,198 copies over the last half year. Here's your royalty check. And one of our ideas is that we want to be not only the advocate for the author, but we want to be able to handle those things that maybe authors aren't as interested in, but would love to know about, but don't have the means to do for themselves. So, for example, one of the things we're going to do is have a dashboard for all of our authors. And the author, depending on what they want to do, he or she can look at it daily. In my earlier days, I would look at it daily. Now I would basically not look at it at all. But to see, wow, I wonder why my sales 5x in Omaha. Oh, well, maybe that's because you wrote a book about Warren Buffett and they just had Woodstock for Capitalism and people are buying the book. And I know that that's an idea of yours as well. And the idea, to expand on what you said a moment ago, of the social media aspect. I think that can be very helpful, obviously, but it doesn't mean just because you have 200,000 followers on Twitter or on Instagram or wherever, doesn't mean you're going to have a great idea for a book necessarily, right? If you've got a good Substack, then that's proof of work, and I like to see that for sure. But social media also tends to, like, reversion to the mean is a concept that is very well known in quantitative investing, which is my old job. And it seems like we're seeing that in publishing as well. What do you think?
That's exactly what I say in my tweet thread. I say regression to the mean, which is the way I was taught that phrase. It means the same thing, right? But yeah, and what's happening is it kind of goes back to what we were talking about with the Peter Thiel thing and the 0 to 1 kind of book writing process. Like, what's happening is these algorithms, and actually Amazon is part of this. And I think the discussion of Amazon is something that you and I and like everybody in the publishing space should be kind of like into in general. But like social media and Amazon kind of contribute to their algorithms are just sort of designed to push people to kind of like take the minimum action. So like with social media, everybody's familiar with this. Like we can all see how, what's being pushed is the stuff that, I'll just like that. It's just kind of like this path of least resistance, this snowball that just gets bigger and bigger and just pushes you toward this like smallest possible like action that then makes something look like it's a really big deal. But that big deal is just like the compilation of a lot of like path of least resistance, like slightly, just ever so slightly, oh yeah, okay, I kind of like that type of actions. Like how often, the other day, someone actually did make me laugh out loud with a tweet, but that's like the exception rather than the rule, Typically stuff, that's just kind of mostly just okay. And the stuff that does really well is just kind of like a little bit better than average. It's not really the most extraordinary, most amazing, most like mind-blowing stuff. And something similar is true with the Amazon kind of system. Amazon is optimizing for buying the book, not reading the book. So what's happening there is like that action. Amazon has brilliantly made the act of buying the book really, really, really easy, right? So they're just doing the same thing. They're optimizing for that path of like, oh, buy the book. But if you talk to anybody, practically anybody, like Kindle completion rates are hilariously low. Like the number of Kindle books people have and then the number that they've gotten past 3%, like that is a ridiculous number. I don't know exactly what it is, but anecdotally, it's like 97% of your Kindle books are stuck below 5% completion. So, it's not good. So that's a big part of this kind of regression. It's like when you're optimizing, I tell this story, it's like I went to a Subaru dealership and like I saw a guy who was like selling Subarus. Like, okay, great. He's selling Subarus. Good for him. And he had a whole stack of like legacy books that kind of all looked the same. They were all just kind of carbon copies of Atomic Habits. They were just all like clones of the same exact book. They were all the exact same size, same color, same binding, same thing. He had this whole stack of books. It was obvious that he hadn't opened a single one of them, but he had bought like all 10 of them. And so that's what the industry is optimizing around. They're optimizing around people who are going to buy. And I can understand why they're doing that because they're like sort of shackled to this business model that is very restrictive. And so this is something you and I kind of talked about another time. Like they're sort of stuck with this business model that's very restrictive where their only real chance of making money has to do with like selling units of books. They can't partner with the author to, for example, like we have authors who are getting paid, $4,000 to $10,000 to go and speak at a place. And we have the beginnings of some partnerships with those people where part of the value that we bring to the table is that we make those speaking engagements possible. And so we're able to capture part of the value of those engagements. Now, a legacy publisher could like never do that. They just can't kind of do that kind of deal at all. So I think it just all speaks to, the need for innovation in the industry because there's just so much old stuff that's weighing them down. I don't remember how exactly we started this train of
we were talking about the reversion to the mean that social media and the model that traditional legacy publishers follow. Oh, he's got or she's got 300,000 Substack. Boy, we're going to be able to sell 50,000 copies of that book. Let's do that book without really thinking. I love your insight though about in AI they call it maximizing the objective function, and I love your idea that Amazon has maximized the objective function for selling the book. It has not maximized the objective function for people actually reading the book and or finding it interesting or learning something new. Now, if I was Amazon, I'd say, well, yeah, we're a retailer. What else do you expect that we're going to maximize for? And I would actually, if they actually said that to me, and I would had their book guy on here, and was talking with him, I'd accept that. And that's why I love what you're doing, what we're trying to do at Infinite Books, what Eric is doing at Scribe. We're not trying to maximize for the objective function. Now, that's got to be a part of our plan, because we don't want our authors that we spend a lot of time and effort with as their partner. We don't want them to not sell their books. So we definitely want to also have a really good marketing arm for what they're doing. But it's not our North Star, nor is it yours, clearly. And so that doesn't mean that you can't do even marketing differently. So a bunch of things back to that dashboard that we are going to have for authors. We also are going to have on-prem AI for our authors. They can, but it will be at their discretion. If they hate AI, they can turn it all the way down to 0 and have nothing to do with it. If they're kind of open to it, they can turn it to like a 6. And if they love it, they can turn it all the way up to a 10. If they had it all the way up to a 10, when that spike in Omaha happened, an AI agent would instantly search for all of the podcasts, all of the people in Omaha who might fit that author's being a guest on their podcast. It will generate emails to that podcast, copying the author, etc. And we just think it will be a much more efficient way to put like-minded people together in terms of giving the opportunity to the author to go on a podcast and talk about their book. And we also are going to have it as a writing coach. I'm a huge fan of AI, but I'm not a fan of AI alone. I'm a huge, huge fan of the Centaur model of AI, which is human plus AI. I think that's where the winning combination is going to go. And so one of the things that we are going to offer, we don't have it yet, we're developing it right now, but we're investors in a different company called Wand. And what it is a AI designed for graphic artists, traditional artists, etc. But what drew me to it was the artists can put all of their own work in, and then the AI riffs on their work. And the number of graphic artists we've heard from, like, this is the most amazing thing that I've ever seen in my life. I put my own drawings in. The new ones come out, and I'm like, holy shit, I never thought about that. That's really good. Then I riff on it, and it's called Wand, by the way, because we actually have a physical like paintbrush that they can use. And so we thought, why don't we do that with writers as well? Why don't we let them have a huge window in which they can put an entire manuscript, for example, and then have the AI work with them back and forth, like, yeah, this is good. Have you ever think about this? What do you think about ideas like that?
Oh, yeah, I'm a huge fan of AI, and I want to get into actually a use case for AI, a few use cases, but yeah, totally. And I kind of, when GPTs came out, you could start making your custom GPTs. I did that with poetry. Like, I created a GPT that sort of, it writes some poems that are definitely reminiscent of mine. It's
up on the GPT store? Can somebody buy it?
I think so. It's called G Poet.
The G Poet. Okay, we will make it. We will make sure that goes into the show notes.
Yeah, but I did do that, and it wasn't bad. I think so. There's a couple things. So one use case that we have for AI that what we have found internally is that, I'll try to make this as clear as possible. So my team and I have a pretty strong understanding of what it takes to, like, ghostwrite a manuscript from start to finish, right? So you have the problem, the ghostwriting problem is you have somebody who's got a bunch of expertise in something, but he doesn't have expertise in writing, right? And then you have, like, writing technicians. Historically, like, the ghostwriting partnership is like, you take one of these guys, you take one of these writing technicians, and you bring them together, and they produce a book. So what we have found is that AI can really not only accelerate that process, but improve that process and make it much, 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 much better than it's ever been before. So we've experimented, and yeah, we don't know everything, although we do have a Palantir guy on our team, so we know a little bit about AI, but we don't know everything, certainly. But we've experimented with like different versions of co-pilots, and, writing feedback can be a use case, but this idea of taking the ghostwriting process and turning it into something that is more transcription based is the thing that we have found is very, very high leverage with AI. So when you have somebody like, and you've met my co-founder, Bill, he comes from like an academic and like legacy publishing background. So he has this superpower of being able to kind of hold a whole book in his head and kind of outline a book in his head. And so he and I together are able to sit with somebody who has expertise in a field, but no expertise really in writing. Go, okay, how do we take this person's expertise and shape it into a step-by-step outline that will eventually become a book? And then what we do is we prompt that individual to respond to fill in each of the modules of that outline. So, okay, like for example, Jim, like now we need an anecdote about a time when you made a big mistake with investing. And let's talk about a couple of those anecdotes. Now we need an anecdote about, reversion to the mean that you personally experienced, whatever, right? So that's just kind of a shallow sort of gesture in the direction of the thing. But it's like, okay, now we need a list of the essential attributes of this thing that you're talking about. Now we need your best definition of this other thing that you're talking about. Now we need all of the counter arguments that you've ever heard to your view. Now we need all the objections that we've ever heard to your view. Now we need how you respond to those objections, that, and the other thing. So then we prompt the human. We use AI transcription, and then we use AI to edit that transcript a little bit and shape that material into something that then fits into that outline that we created together, like with that person. And the outcome there is a book that, in a sense, was written by no one, which is really interesting, but is better typically than something that would be written by a ghostwriter, where with the ghostwriting, there's a couple of factors that come into play. One is a lot of ghostwriters aren't really that structural in their thinking compared to what I'm describing. And also, they'll kind of add their own ideas in places where it might not be desirable. Whereas this really is about like getting this from the source, getting this from the horse's mouth. So what I'm really excited about with AI is the potential to bring more people's expertise into this format that wasn't possible before.
Yes, and that is very similar to our approach to this as well. I personally think that having experimented, I was a very early adopter of AI back when they called it machine learning as opposed to AI, and saw the potential across so many industries. But one of the first things I said was, oh my God, it would have been so much easier. I only wrote one book for the general public, and that was called How to Retire Rich, which basically took the principles of the far more technical What Works on Wall Street and made them much more user-friendly, I guess is the way to put it. And I was thinking about that book and thinking, boy, that would have been a better book had I had this tool available to me right now, using it in the way that you suggest. I definitely think that that is one of the more exciting changes and tools available to authors today, and specifically to people who, as you mentioned, would probably not have written a book prior to this ability to be prompted, et cetera. Another thing that I'm really noticing with AI is people are far more willing to take some like really critical feedback if it's not from another person, right? You mentioned the idea that the ghostwriter will be like, well, I know that the domain expert thinks this, but I think it's really this way. And then they slip their opinions in, sometimes surreptitiously. And if the domain expert isn't reading very, very carefully, they might get by. But one of the things I've really noticed, and I do this experiment a lot, I will put in something I've written, and then I always, one of the first questions I ask is, please suggest and enumerate the weak points of this piece of writing. And I gotta be honest, sometimes like they're really nasty and harsh, but you're willing to be like, oh yeah, you know what, that's good for you, ChatGPT. You're right. And also the idea that I love that you include in the way you do it is you really need to steel man your argument. That's another thing I do quite a bit of.
Sure.
I always try to take an argument that I might not agree with and put the best piece of it that I've read into a large language model and then say, steel man this for me. Show me why this argument is right. Okay. So then it comes up with a pretty good steel man. But then I'll do the opposite and say, please point out all of the deficiencies in this particular thing. By doing that, you really get out of the habit. See, one of the things that I just hate, although I am a very lazy human being, I'm fully cop to this all the time. So I'm very, very lazy, but this idea of straw mans just really annoys me. And I've read so many books that are essentially straw man arguments. And I think that AI is going to really, really help either dissuade that author from, like, that's another thing I deeply believe. If you cannot write what an idea you're having or what you think about something, if you can't write it, you don't know what you're talking about. It's an exercise that I've done forever since I was a young person. And it's really, really helpful because getting the words on paper is like it's one of the best ways to call bullshit on yourself, I think, because it's like, I got nothing. Then you realize that what that is a whim or an opinion that you just happen to have that doesn't really have any kind of support or verification. What do you think? What do you think about the role of agents? Do you think that those are going to disappear? Do you think they're going to change? Because you mentioned that you are using the opportunity to help your authors get speaking gigs. My agent, his real business, honestly, is the speaking bureau attached to his agency. And
is that true?
Yeah, his name's Wes Neff. He does huge business in the speaking bureau. I did some speeches for him where you get paid. Obviously, I was so used to making speeches on behalf of my company, and those you do for free because you are trying to attract clients.
Right.
But, it was never really my gig. And he was funny because he was like, well, Jim, most authors, it's like musicians. They don't make anything from the recordings. They make things from the merchandise and from the touring. And he said, authors can make a very nice living, just doing the speeches. But what do you think? Do you think the role of agent is going to disappear, or is it going to transform?
I think that historically agents have been the middleman. That's like more of a publicist role. So like your agent is kind of playing the role of both a publicist and an agent. Historically, I would say agents have just been a middleman between publishers and authors. And I think that they're already kind of being largely phased out today. A lot of what they're doing is just helping authors build up a social media following and build up a personal brand that's going to be seen as attractive by publishers, right? So I think that in the future, publishers are going to kind of continue lumbering along, like doing the things that they're inclined to do and sort of doing. They're going to continue lumbering along. They're going to continue producing certain kinds of output. But I think for those of us who are on the frontier, I think a personal connection between the publisher and the author actually talking directly to one another is going to be a lot more productive and a lot more creative than an agent kind of playing the middleman. Does that make sense?
It does. That was one of my simple hypotheses when we were looking at all what we term the Great Reshuffle. And like one of my earlier business hypotheses was we're entering an era where the middleman is going to effectively be cut out. And not just in publishing, by the way, in many areas. The one that quite frankly has surprised me that it's taken as long as it's taken is like that of real estate agents. It seems to me that that's just sort of begging for disintermediation. So Wes, if you're listening, I love you. I'll keep you as my agent. I'm not going to write another book probably, because if I do, it's going to be Infinite Books that publish it. So anyway, just teasing. Another thing that you started that I really like the idea is this. You call it Muse by Mail. Tell us a little bit about Muse by Mail, because I think it's really innovative and very clever.
I'm really, really appreciative that you asked me about that. Thank you so much. That is the latest and greatest experiment coming out of Altamira. And I'm just really excited about it because I had a revelation that led to it. And the revelation that I had was, I really love, by the way, I love a lot of the architecture that you guys are building. I love a lot of the stuff that I've seen from so many frontier kind of publishers in the space and all this stuff. But what I've realized, and we, we published our first book almost exactly 2 years ago now.
Congratulations.
Crazy. It's like a wild ride, man. It's just really just weird. But what I realized is that the focus on what authors need is really, really crucial, but so is the focus on what readers need. And that's the thing that I didn't, and I think a lot of publishers in the space have been thinking a lot about what authors need. We've been thinking a lot about the money and the support, and that's all really important. But really, just as much as authors need to be served differently by publishers, readers need to be served differently by publishers. And especially, and I think that's going to start with the readers who are kind of a little bit of both. The readers who are creative people, whether they write or want to be authors or are entrepreneurs or are creative in any kind of other way. So I think that the future for authors and readers is to be brought together by publishers in a way that's a lot more personal, a lot more intimate, and a lot more inspiring. And so the idea of Muse by Mail is it is a personalized mail drop for creative people. And you can, if you go to musebymail.com, you will be able to access whatever the latest iteration of this actually is, which I don't even know when this podcast goes live. I don't even know exactly where it's going to be. But the idea is this. I've put a lot of time into writing coaching. I've spent a lot of time understanding people who are on a creative journey, whether it's an entrepreneurial journey or an author journey or other types of creative journeys as well. I've put a lot of time into understanding what people need when they're on that type of journey. And at this point, people are actually shocked by this. But at this point, a huge part of the value that I add as a writing coach or anything like that is just inspiration. The ability to kind of give people exactly that dose of inspiration that they need to carry on. And so if you sign up for Muse by Mail, you sign up for these mail drops that happen quarterly. The first thing that's going to happen is I personally will get in touch with you and I will ask you about your creative journey and like what's going on and what you're doing. And I will be able to get a sense for the kinds of stuff that will actually help you, that will be signal and not noise. And I will, on a quarterly basis, send you a book and also an edition of The Muse, which is this new publication that's all focused on the creative journey. It's going to be packaged up in there, as well as other kind of personalized things. It's going to actually be individualized and curated just for you. So that's kind of an experiment in terms of serving readers, and it's going to be a combination of the books that we put out, as well as books that other people have published, as well as just other things in general. And I think for now, it's only launched to people who I actually know personally. So I'm really, really excited to put it to the test with people who I don't know as well.
Very cool idea. And that, I think ultimately that's what all of this is about. My friend Jimmy Soni made a joke that, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if it isn't a topic of conversation at a very swanky midtown cocktail party, most publishers be like, why would we ever even look at something like that? Right. So it's a very insular kind of old school way of doing it. And look, all of the people who published my book were traditional publishers, and I got a tremendous amount of advancement in my career from my books. And so, I that was my objective. My objective was, in the old days, you wanted to have a book on to sort of precede you so that people would know and understand your view on the way to do whatever that particular thing is. I'm speaking strictly about nonfiction here. But I definitely think that we are I personally believe we're going to see a Cambrian-like explosion of new books that under the old system would never have seen print, would never have seen even digital for that matter, because of people like you, because of people like Eric over at Scribe and hopefully Infinite Books and everyone else who's going to get great ideas to do test new ideas in the world of publishing. Because it just seems to me and like I was making the crack about real estate agents, many of my friends are real estate agents. I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about all those other ones. But the idea that it's taken until kind of now, I love seeing all of this activity, like with your company and you and Eric and his, and the willingness to just experiment. That's what I loved about your Muse in a Box, right? Like, you can afford to take these kinds of small experiments and just see how they do. And I find that very exciting, right? Because our point of view is not like, the traditional, if you're doing it with a VC, right? What would the VC say to you? Well, but that doesn't scale. No, it probably doesn't. Nope. You can't individualize things. But what it does do, in my opinion, is it creates a fan for life, right? And if you can create, I personally believe that if I would take 100 people who absolutely loved a book that we were publishing, and the effect that they would have on that book and its sales and everything else, I would take that over maybe even the best ad campaign in legacy media that you could come up with. Because I don't know if you're like me, but I'll use movies or books actually as an example. So my wife is a huge reader. Everyone in my family is, but she reads almost exclusively literary fiction. And I'm always really eager because she has, and I kid you not, she has a perfect batting average with recommending new fiction books to me. because she's really a tough grader. She graduated summa cum laude in journalism and actually was the editor of my books. And I just think, I was thinking about it I was just talking to her last night. She's a book that she's been raving about. And she goes, but I'm not done with it yet. So you can't count this as a recommendation. But you take that kind of person so much more seriously than you take, this is the blurbs people put up online and whatnot. A lot of that's just kind of a game, honestly. And I played it, to be honest. And yet I love the effect of what you're trying to get across there and the experiments that you're trying to run. I think they're really brilliant. If you could we always try to help our listeners and viewers. We probably have a lot about people listening and watching this right now who are like, boy, I would really love to. I would really love to start on that book, or this idea is worth being a book, etc. And you're also a writing coach and a good one. What do you think the best advice you could give to somebody who's just kind of, they're close, but they're not quite there to committing to getting the ideas on paper or into a recorder or whatever manner they want to do it? What's your piece of advice for that person? Is it just start? Is it Nike's just do it? Or do you have something
best piece of advice
more nuanced?
The advice that I have is think of someone you love. Someone you love very much. Could be your spouse, could be your child, could be a really good friend, could be a sibling, parent, someone you love. And think about if you had just this one chance to express your love to that person and to leave that person with something to remember you by. What would come out? What would you write down? I would start there. And a lot of times when people do this exercise, it's very profound. And then I go, okay, you did that. Good. Because that's the most important thing you could have possibly done. Now, think about just a few other people in your life, the people who you really, really care about, the people who you want to succeed, you want to see them have a great future. If you could leave them with just one thing, what would that be? And somewhere in those two exercises, you will definitely find your book idea or the gift that you have to give to the world. And you'll definitely be able to uncover that compass that we were talking about that leads you in the direction of your best creative work. Another thing I a lot of times say is make art, not noise. Life is too short for disposable content. And lead by example. Do and say the things that you hope other people will also say. But that exercise is a great way to kind of unlock the compass that you're following and the gift that you have to give to the world.
Wow. I love that, because that's the other part. People sometimes think, like, how can I write something that's going to really appeal to a lot of people? How can I, write something that goes viral? And I agree with you wholeheartedly that you should be doing the opposite. You should be writing something very, very specific to somebody you know. I love the way you extended from, that one special person to the larger, or it's still not a large group, but the larger segment that you want to talk to. I think that's a huge mistake that people make. And that's why you get so much of the banality and the, like, oh, this one's going to be a zinger. What's the thing from Succession, the meme? All bangers all the time with the the least banger guy saying that in the meme. So is that something that you also incorporate into, tell me a little bit about coaching. I know you do that. Is that a separate line, or do you do it with people that you're also publishing?
It's a little bit of both. When we started, it was just writing coaching, and we worked a lot of times with like CEOs who we still do that, looking to improve their communications with their internal team, with their investors, just with themselves to some degree, founder CEOs with their visions and stuff. And we've been, tremendously helpful. A lot of CEOs speak very, very, very highly of the help that we've provided there. So it's like we work with executives who have no intention of writing a book, but who kind of do all this writing in today's business world as part of what they do. And then we also work with everybody who publishes a book with us, or people who want to self-publish, or go some other route. We work with people who it doesn't really matter where they want to publish. We provide we're the best in the world at this stuff. When Penguin or Simon & Schuster have an author who their own internal editorial teams are struggling to help them bring their book to the finish line, literally they call us. So we've helped people create Amazon self-published bestsellers. We've helped people create legacy published books that have done extremely well. We've helped people publish their books from start to finish. So yeah, we do that. And we have a very white glove, very personal approach to it. That's very much okay, if we love this project, and if we love you, and if we think that this is something that should be in the world, then yeah, we do that. That's based at writing.coach. But yeah, we're a tiny team, and the whole thing is just all kind of, the Altamira Studio and the writing.coach thing. It's kind of all one. It's one initiative around, it just goes back to me feeling like my place is just being at the frontier of writing the hardest challenges and, the most interesting challenges in the writing world. That's what I'm looking for. So if you think you have one of those, then I'm definitely curious about it.
That was also when I was writing around, what do I see? What might happen with traditional publishers? And that was actually one of the ideas that I had, was that what they were going to do was go, you know what? We really suck at publicity. We really suck at helping the author with editing. We haven't put the resources into that. And I thought, if I was a PE guy, I'm not a PE guy. But if I was a private equity guy, one of the things, and I wanted to buy a publisher, I would probably do exactly what you just described. I would keep the mothership. I would get rid of virtually all of the functions that are not so great in it, and I'd outsource them to brilliant people like you. And I'm kind of surprised. I'm happy to hear you say that they're actually doing that. But I think I'd go all in on that, because that's the other aspect that is part of our thesis, is the internet, the interconnectivity, the tools that are available right now. There are so many bright, innovative, creative people in the world right now, and you can find them. That's the big difference, right? That's why we started our fellowship program, because in the old days, a genius could be born, live, and died without knowing that they're good at anything, without ever getting it expressed. And that is no longer the case. We can find and fund these types of people. And I think it's a wonderful experiment, because it also underlines our raison d'etre, which is we can create now at a scale that was literally unimaginable even 20 years ago, because of the aggregating nature of social media, for example. You've got to use it very carefully, right? If you do it the right way, I think it can be an enormously powerful tool. The problem is that most people don't do it the right way. What are you most excited about right now? Be it a book, be it something you're doing at the company. What do you like when you wake up and you think, oh God, I'm so glad I've got this that I'm working on?
I would say, honestly, I'm really excited about Ask Aristotle. I'm really excited about it because for now, it's gone out to a few hundred people, and every single person who I've actually contacted and talked to about it has been like, this changed my life. Like, this book just totally changed my life. I'm now listening to Aristotle podcasts on my drive and stuff like that. And we are releasing an audiobook soon, which will be recorded by a professional actor. And we chose him very carefully based on, thinking that he would really do justice to this project and stuff like that. And I can't wait for that because both of my brothers are like quite a bit younger than I am. They're both like in Gen Z. And I asked both of them, I'm like, do you guys ever read books? They're like, oh yeah, we read a ton of books. I'm like, oh, can I send you some books? And they were like, oh, we only read audiobooks. And so I'm really, really excited about that. And that should be out pretty soon as well. I'm just super pumped. I never really realized how big, because I'm thrilled to be on this podcast. This was like super fun. I love this. I never realized how big of a thing the audio format was. And so I'm really excited about that. And I think people are going to love how much they get from just a few hours of listening time for that.
Yeah. It's a great book. Thank you for sending it to me. I'm a huge philosophy nerd as well. And so I can give you your blurb right now. For people who wish they would like some philosophy, but just haven't been able to get into it because a lot of philosophers weren't the greatest writers in the world. They could be a little turgid and sometimes a little hard to understand. This book is really, really great. Well, Ellen, I absolutely am enamored of you and what you're doing. And I just think it's such an exciting time to be in publishing, to be doing all of these things, new ideas and everything. Because like I say, I honestly think that writing has never been more important. I know that's one of David Perell's big things, but I really agree with him. Writing has gone, even if you're not going to write a book, right? Your ability to be able to communicate through the written word has never been more important, in my opinion. And so I love what you're doing. I love all of the chances you're taking. I love that this was and I'm holding up for the first book that she published with her poetry. It's very fresh. It's very creative. And I just think you guys are doing a great job. If you've listened to my podcast, you know that we do have a final question. And our final question is kind of fun because we're going to wave a wand and we're going to make you the Empress of the world. You can't kill anyone. You can't put anyone in a re-education camp. But what you can do, I think, is maybe more lasting and better. We're going to give you a magic microphone, since this is magical in its nature. And you can say two things into that microphone. And you are going to incept all 8 billion plus people on the planet who are going to wake up whenever their next day is. And they're going to think, wow, I just had two of the greatest ideas, but this time I'm actually going to act on them. What two things are you going to incept in the world's population?
Number one, I would say, is lead by example. And the second one I would say is make art, not noise.
Oh, I love that one. I'm gonna, when I put up that I had a wonderful conversation with you. I don't want to, I was going to say I was going to lead with that, but I don't want people I don't want to do a spoiler on such a great line. Ellen, tell people where they can find you and Altamira and your other work.
Yeah, awesome. You can find me on Twitter, Ellen Rhymes. That's my handle. And you can find me at writing.coach and altamira.studio.
Perfect. Well, I wish you absolutely the best. We will keep a close eye and be in contact, no doubt, over collaborations to come. Thank you so much for joining me.
I'm really grateful. Thank you, Jim. This was so much fun.